Hello, everybody. I hope that this finds you healthy and well and safe at home. Virtual elbow bump. So we are going to take a look today at some of the physiology of the heart and how the heart rate is controlled. Take a look also a little bit about some signs that the doctor is going to look for to make sure that your heart is actually functioning properly as we take a look at the physiology of the heart here. So as we get started here, first thing to know is that the heart has an intrinsic conduction system that's referred to as a nodal system, and you'll see why in just a second here, because your heart muscle cells actually contract without any nerve impulses in a regular, continuous way. So they don't need to be receiving signals from the brain saying contract. They actually contract on their own in a regular way. So if we take a look here, there are some really important structures that we are going to need to be familiar with. One of them here is a special bundle of cells in the myocardium of the right atrium. It is lateral to the entrance for the vena cava, called the sinoatrial node, also referred to as the SA node, or the pacemaker of the heart, because it sets the pace for the heart to actually beat. Some other important structures are the atrioventricular node here in the wall between the right atrium and right ventricle. And then we are going to have what's called the atrioventricular bundle, or bundle of His, coming down from the AV node that splits into these bundle branches. Here, there's a left bundle branch and a right bundle branch, which then split into special fibers called Purkinje fibers, going up the walls of the left ventricle and right ventricle here. So we're going to get into a little bit about the functions of all of those parts in controlling your heartbeat here in just a minute. Okay, so what sets the pace for your heart? How does the heartbeat actually start? It starts with that special bundle of cells in the wall of the right atrium called the sinoatrial node, or SA node, that is the pacemaker of the heart. And unlike most cells, when these muscle cells depolarize, they immediately will repolarize like other contractile excitable cells do. But as soon as they repolarize, they begin to depolarize again on their own. Most cells, once they repolarize, stay repolarized until they receive a signal from a neuron to cause them to depolarize and send an action potential. Not the case with the special cells in the sinoatrial node. Once they repolarize, they immediately begin to depolarize on their own until they reach threshold, at which point they send an action potential. And that reaches all the cells of both atria almost simultaneously, because all of the cells of the atria are connected, and they are connected through those special intercalated discs that we learned about when we learned about cardiac muscle earlier this year. So all the cells of the atria essentially act as one large cell that all contract at the same time. As that action potential is being sent from the sinoatrial node, it will eventually reach the atrioventricular node through special fibers called junctional fibers that I'll show you on the next slide. And again, that's found at the junction of the right and left atria and ventricles here. And then the AV node, once it receives that signal, the cells in the AV node will depolarize and relay an action potential down to the AV bundle, or bundle of His, through the bundle branches that I showed you, down through the Purkinje fibers. And those Purkinje fibers relay that signal up the walls of the two ventricles, and the ventricles contract with kind of a twisting motion upward to force that blood up into your aorta and pulmonary trunk. So your signal that starts the heartbeat starts at the SA node, travels through the atrial syncytium. That's what we refer to all the cells of the atria as a syncytium, which is basically a coordinated group that all acts together as one. So all the cells of the atria act together as one big cell. They all contract at the same time. that the signal from the SA node not only goes to all those cells of the atria at the same time, but they travel through junctional fibers down to the AV node. And one thing to note about those junctional fibers is that they have a very narrow diameter. So if you remember from your physics, the narrower a wire, the more resistance that it provides. And so the electrical signal traveling through that wire is going to be slower, right? The electrical conductivity is going to be less. The signal is going to travel slower through those junctional fibers. So that delays the signal reaching the AV node, which allows the atria to contract and the ventricles to fill so that not all four chambers contract at once. Then the AV node relays that signal to the AV bundle or bundle of His, down those bundle branches, the left and right bundle branches, to the Purkinje fibers, and then to all the cells of the ventricles, which all contract at the same time in that twisting motion. All right, so here's your SA node, right? That's going to send signals to all the cells of both atria to get them to contract at both all at the same time, that atrial syncytium. Then the signal travels down these junctional fibers with that narrow diameter that slows the signal down before it reaches the AV bundle, the AV node, reaches the AV node, which then relays the signal to the AV bundle, down the bundle branches, and then to all of the Purkinje fibers here, which go to all the cells of the ventricles. All right, so now how do we take a look at whether or not your heart, your conduction system, your cardiac conduction system is actually functioning properly? One way is by taking what's called an electrocardiogram, or EKG or ECG for short. And you've probably seen these types of readouts before. You got all these bumps here. And what we're going to do is take a look at what's going on with each one of these bumps. We have what's called a P wave, a QRS wave, and then a T wave. And so we're going to take a look at what does each one of these indicate. And then we'll get to this ventricular fibrillation in another slide or two. So the electrocardiogram, EKG or ECG, there's three formations that we're concerned about. The P wave is when the electrical impulse travels across the atria. We get that little bump for the P wave. That is caused by the depolarization of your atrial muscle cells. So they are all firing that action potential when we see that P wave. All the atrial muscle cells are contracting. The QRS complex that we saw, that is when that impulse spreads down the septum and around the ventricles into the Purkinje fibers. What's happening when you see this QRS complex is the depolarization of your ventricular muscle cells. So what you're seeing there is the action potential reaching all the cells of the ventricles. And then the T wave is when the electrical activity stops in the ventricles, and what we see there is the repolarization of the ventricle. Now, the repolarization of the atria, we don't see a bump in the graph for when that happens. And the reason why, I don't know if you can maybe figure it out. This is a question I usually ask in class when we're face-to-face. But the reason would be that the atria are repolarizing at the same time as the ventricles are depolarizing. So when you see that QRS complex, that's when the atria are repolarizing. So again, we got the P wave here. That's when the atria are depolarized and they will be contracting. The QRS wave is when that electrical signal reaches the ventricles and all the cells of all the muscle cells of the ventricles are depolarized and contracting. And then the T wave, this bump here, is caused by the repolarization of the ventricles. The repolarization of the atria would be occurring right here when we already have this large peak because of the depolarization of the ventricles. So the repolarization of the atria is hidden by this QRS wave. Now, what can happen sometimes is what's called ventricular fibrillation. And with that, what happens is the cells of the ventricles are not all contracting at the same time like they should. The ventricles kind of start fluttering because none of the cells are contracting at the same time. This leads to a very low output of blood. Blood pressure drops drastically. Vital organs like the brain are not getting blood or oxygen or nutrients. And so without immediate attention, ventricular fibrillation can leads to death. So when we talk about the heart and we take a look at some things that go wrong with the heart, so pathology of the heart, in other words, diseases of the heart, problems with the heart, if there's damage to the AV node, that can release the ventricles from control of the AV node, leading to a slower heartbeat. And a slower heartbeat with the ventricles can lead to ventricular fibrillation. Now, what might cause this ventricular fibrillation besides some kind of damage to the AV node? A heart attack that damages the tissue, the cells of the ventricles, or blood flow to the cells of the ventricles can lead to fibrillation. Tissue damage can also lead to ventricular fibrillation. The atria can also go into fibrillation. That's called AFib, which can also be life-threatening, could cause heart attacks, strokes, blood clots. That can be treated though with the installation of a pacemaker in the heart to take over control from the SA node if AFib or atrial fibrillation is something that the doctor finds that you have. So fibrillation is rapid, irregular, unsynchronized contraction of your muscle fibers. Some other problems associated with the heart besides fibrillation would be tachycardia, which is a heart rate of more than 100 beats per minute. That could be because of strenuous exercise. It could also be because of stress caused by fevers, caused by excessive alcohol use. All of those things can cause tachycardia, which can lead to tissue damage and heart attacks over time. Bradycardia is when you have a heart rate of less than 60 beats per minute, and that can often be caused by a weakening of the heart muscle due to age, due to heart attacks, and other problems. All right. Besides looking at an EKG or ECG, something else that the doctor is going to want to take a look at is if the heart is emptying and filling properly. If the cardiac cycle is taking place as it should. So are the atria contracting simultaneously, then are they relaxing and the ventricles contracting? When a part of the heart contracts, we say that part of the heart is in systole. So when the atria contract, we have atrial systole. And at the same time that the atria are contracting, the ventricles are relaxing. And so the ventricles are in diastole. Then when the atria relax, we say the atrial diastole, the ventricles contract and we have ventricular systole. So the cardiac cycle consists of the atria contracting and filling the ventricles, then the ventricles contracting and forcing blood out into the blood vessels, then the atria filling again as the blood returns to the heart. So to see whether the cardiac cycle is functioning properly or not, doctors can measure your cardiac output, which is the amount of blood pumped by each side of the heart in 1 minute. And it can be calculated very easily by taking your heart rate times your stroke volume. And your stroke volume is the volume of blood pumped by each ventricle in one contraction. Okay, so to calculate cardiac output, you take the heart rate times stroke volume. So typical heart rate is about 75 beats per minute. Typical stroke volume is about 70 milliliters per beat. So you end up, if you multiply those two together, you end up with about 5,250 milliliters of blood pumped through your body per minute. And normal is about 5,000 milliliters per minute. So basically what happens is your entire blood supply passes through your body once every minute. Okay, but the cardiac output will vary with the demands of your body. If you are exercising, that's going to increase your heart rate, and so your cardiac output goes up. If you are sleeping, resting, your heart rate goes down, cardiac output goes down. Okay, so typically your stroke volume remains relatively constant as long as your heart muscle maintains its elasticity. So as your ventricles fill, the heart muscle gets stretched, and as it stretches, that will increase how strong it will eventually rebound and contract to force that blood out. That is called Starling's law of the heart. But changing the heart rate is the most common way to change your cardiac output. The amount of blood that's pumped out typically does not change. Now, you do know that your heart rate goes up, your heart rate goes down. So the sinoatrial node, the SA node, is what starts the heartbeat. But what causes the SA node to increase the rate that the heart beats at, or what causes it to slow down the rate that the heart beats at? Well, there's several things. Your sympathetic nervous system in times of crisis, so fight or flight situations, or when your blood pressure is low, that will start sending signals to your heart to increase your heart rate. Different hormones that the body produces: epinephrine, which is adrenaline, which again is produced when we are in fight or flight situations. Thyroxine, which is a thyroid hormone that increases your metabolism. That will increase your heart rate. Exercise, increases your heart rate because as you exercise, the amount of carbon dioxide that your body is generating goes up. And so, and the oxygen demands of your muscle cells goes up. So your heart rate will increase to meet the demands of the body. And then if the body detects a decrease in blood volume, the heart rate will be stimulated to increase to keep the cardiac output to what your body needs. When does your heart rate drop? When the parasympathetic nervous system is activated during times of resting or digesting. When your blood pressure or blood volume increases, your heart rate will be stimulated to decrease. If you have less blood returning to the heart, that will cause your heart rate to go down. And then one problem associated with the heart is congestive heart failure, which we're going to talk about in more detail. But the heart basically gets worn out and pumps really weakly. So then you get less return of blood to the heart, then that decreases the heart rate, which causes a more and more of a slowdown of the heart. One drug that can be given to help combat congestive heart failure is called digitalis, that works to provide a slow, steady, strong heart rate. Okay, so this graphic here just kind of outlines a lot of the things that I just went through, so I'll let you take a look at that on your own time. You can pause the video and read through it, and then email me if you have any questions. So congestive heart failure is what we call a decline in the pumping efficiency of the heart. So it's not pumping as well as it should be. And that leads to an inadequate circulation of blood through the body. Your cardiac output goes down. Congestive heart failure is progressive and can be caused by coronary atherosclerosis, which is a hardening and narrowing of the arteries that supply blood to the heart. So the heart muscle is not getting as much oxygen, becomes weaker. High blood pressure, chronic high blood pressure can eventually cause the heart to wear out. And a history of multiple myocardial infarctions. Sounds funny, not funny. Myocardial infarctions are heart attacks. So if the left side of your heart fails, you end up having pulmonary congestion and suffocation, because if you think about what's happening, the left side of the heart, you've got blood returning from the lungs. So if the left side of the heart starts working less efficiently, then that blood in your pulmonary veins backs up, and some of the fluid starts to leak out of the capillaries from the lungs, because you get all this blood backing up, and that fluid fills the lungs, making it much harder to breathe. If the right side of your heart fails, then what happens is that means that blood returning from the body backs up. So you get congestion in the periphery, and you end up with what's called edema. And edema is just swelling because you get fluid leaking out of your blood vessels and filling all the tissues of your body. And so patients that have edema, one thing that the doctor is going to be concerned about is that the right side of their heart is not functioning properly. So that is the physiology of the heart. If you have any questions about anything that I covered here, please email me and I will do my best to help.